This evening I had just finished working on some old business in my office when a thick envelope with an exquisite coat of arms fell on my desk. The letter turned out to be a real mystery. There was no sender's address on it, but inside was a short invitation to dinner at Mr. Jonathan Fox's mansion. I wondered why this eccentric rich man, known for his secrecy, would invite me. I'd heard of Fox. A collector, a philanthropist, but with a reputation for shady connections. His name was mentioned in cases involving bribes and strange disappearances. I couldn't pass up the chance to find out more. The next evening I stood at the massive doors of his mansion. The facade of the building was striking in its Gothic detail, and the windows, framed in time-darkened frames, seemed to watch my every move. The housekeeper opened the door with a frown and invited me into the spacious living room. 8 other guests were already gathered there. Some of them seemed vaguely familiar to me: journalists, businessmen, politicians. The atmosphere was tense, as if each of them had been here involuntarily. Suddenly Fox appeared. Tall, in a perfectly tailored suit, he smiled, but there was more than cordiality in his eyes. "Welcome, ladies and gentlemen," he said with a touch of sarcasm. "This is going to be an unforgettable evening for all of us." His words made me wary. Something in his tone suggested that he was up to something. But I didn't know then that it would be his last meal. Dinner began in a huge dining room with a carved oak table. Candles lit up the faces of the guests, and a thunderstorm raged outside the windows. Each of us tried to stay calm, but tension hung in the air. Fox proved to be a great host. He knew how to keep the attention. His stories about rare exhibits and collections were mesmerizing. But everything changed when, raising his glass, he said, "All of you are here because we have something in common. Each of you knows what mystery is." Everyone looked at each other. I saw the fingers of one of the businessmen start tapping nervously on the table. The journalist sitting across the table almost spilled his wine glass. Fox's words seemed to have touched something inside everyone present. But more about that later, he added with a mysterious smile and went into his office. As soon as the door closed behind him, the guests began to whisper. Some were clearly nervous, but no one dared to ask a direct question. I had a feeling this evening was going to turn out to be more than just a dinner party. About 15 minutes passed, but Fox still hadn't returned. One of the guests, a journalist named Catherine, suggested we check to see if he was okay. Along with 2 other guests, we made our way to his office. The door was locked. I knocked, but there was no answer. At that moment, I heard a strange sound, a faint rustle, like someone moving down the hall. Leaving the others at the door, I rushed to check, but there was no one there. Returning, I decided to pick the lock. Fortunately, I had experience in that. After a minute, the door gave way, and what we saw left everyone stunned. Fox was lying on the floor, next to the chair. His face was contorted in agony, and in his hands he clutched a piece of paper with one word: everything. The room was eerily clean, no sign of struggle or intrusion. No footprints on the floor, no prints on the doors. The only thing that disturbed this sterility was the smoldering tip of a cigar in the ashtray. Then I realized that what lay ahead was not just a mystery, but a real puzzle. If that's okay, let's move on to the next 3 episodes. The other guests entered the room. Their faces were a mixture of shock and fear. One of them, a man in his 50s in a smart suit, interrupted the silence. "This is crazy. We were all here. How is this even possible?" I looked around at everyone in silence. There was one thing in their gazes: fear. Each of them seemed to be trying to hide something that might give them away more than they wanted to. I walked over to Fox's body and scrutinized him once more. The paper in his hands, with the single word all on it, looked especially strange. Why had he written that? What did it mean? Meanwhile, one of the guests, journalist Catherine, remarked, "Maybe it's just a stroke or something. Did you see the way he looked at the table? He could have been nervous." "Nervous because he knew it would happen," another guest, a young man with sharp features, said abruptly. "Or maybe he gathered us here on purpose to put on some kind of show." But I knew it wasn't just a stroke. I could see slight pressure marks on Fox's neck. Someone had tried to hold him down at the last moment. It wasn't an accident. I quickly asked a question. "Did anyone leave the living room before we discovered the body?" The answer was no. But that didn't mean anything. Fox's room had another window, and I knew for a fact that it could have been opened. Support me by subscribing to the channel if you want more detective stories. I'm doing this for you, and your support inspires me. Let me know what you think of the video in the comments. Your opinion is really important. I asked all the guests to stay in the dining room and talked to each of them in turn. The conversations were intense, and with each one I became more and more convinced that everyone there had a different motive for hating Fox. Catherine, a journalist, admitted that she had once written an exposé on his machinations, but had to withdraw it due to pressure. The young man, Richard, turned out to be the owner of a small company that Fox threatened with his influence. Even an elderly lady, seemingly harmless, revealed that she had lost her son because of Fox's dealings. Each of them had reason to wish him dead. But which of them had made up their minds? At that moment, I realized that maybe we were talking about more than one killer. What if they each had a role to play in this case? My attention was caught by the note in Fox's hands. All of them. The word sounded like an accusation. Gathering everyone back around the table, I decided to press on. "Let's be honest, which one of you was in Fox's office?" I said, watching everyone's reactions carefully. There was a dead silence. But at that moment Catherine couldn't take it anymore. "I was there," she said. "But it was earlier. I talked to him before dinner." "Why?" I asked. "He wanted me to write a book about him." I refused, her voice trembled. "And the others?" I shifted my gaze to the others. One by one, they began to admit that they had stopped by the office during the day, each on their own business. It all looked as if Fox had lured them there himself, but why? In the midst of all this tense atmosphere, I noticed another detail, a bottle of wine on the table. It was almost full, but one of the glasses on the table was empty. "Who drank this wine?" I asked, raising the glass. No one answered. Then I realized that the killer had used it to hide his plan. But who? The room was starting to get stuffy. Every look, every detail, every sound made it feel like the walls were shrinking. I looked around the table again. The empty wine glass, the note with the single word everything pointed to more than just a coincidence. I stood up and looked around Fox's office once more. There was an envelope on his desk. There were several addressees, and among them were all the guests. It was a list of the invitees, as well as letters with their personal information. Fox had collected dirt on each of them. In the letters I found evidence of Richard's machinations, Catherine's financial scams, and even information about the past that the old lady was trying to hide. She was involved in her son's illegal dealings. The bottom line was clear: Fox had invited them to blackmail them. Perhaps he thought he'd keep them under control that way, but he'd miscalculated. I returned to the dining room with an envelope. "Each of you was blackmailed by Fox," I said. "Each of you was in the study, and each of you had a motive for wanting him dead." There was silence in the room again. But motive alone is not enough. One of you decided to kill him. And it wasn't spontaneous. At that moment Catherine rose abruptly. This is ridiculous. We all here may have hated him, but I didn't kill anyone, she said. Her voice was filled with despair, but her eyes were filled with fear. I looked around the room. The faces of the guests were tense, their hands clenched into fists. No one spoke, but the tension was building. You were all part of this murder, I began. What? Richard shouted. That's absurd. No, it's true, I continued. Each and every one of you left your mark on this room. You may not even realize it, but you all played a part. I looked at Catherine. You put sleeping pills in the wine, thinking it would give you an advantage in talking to Fox. She tried to object, but I held up my hand. Richard. You knew he'd try to make you look like a bankrupt, so you rigged his papers to disappear. Richard backed away, but didn't say a word. And you, Mrs. Langley, I turned to the older woman. You entered the office to destroy documents related to your son. The room froze. But someone had taken advantage of the chaos and struck the final blow. I looked at everyone before continuing. It was Richard. You took advantage of their actions to commit a crime and make sure that suspicion would fall on each of them. Richard turned pale. That's a lie. No, I pulled the note out of my pocket. Here's the proof. It's your letter threatening Fox if he doesn't leave you alone. Richard realized he'd lost. He sat silently in his seat with his head down. The other guests were shocked. Each of them felt guilty for their part, but only Richard had dared to kill. The finale left me with a heavy feeling. It wasn't just a blackmail game, it was a clash of people who were trapped by their mistakes. No one can feel innocent, I said as I left the house. And it was true. Did you like the story? Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new investigations. I'm always putting in the effort for you, and your support means a lot. Leave a comment, I'd love to hear your thoughts.